Hi guys, my name is Abdurrahman Gilal, and in this video I'll be explaining something about OWASP standards, IoT top 10 threats or vulnerabilities. There are two major approaches by which one can identify threats to a system. One is that you have a reactive approach, which means that you have a system and then you wanted to try to see like if there are any vulnerabilities in the system. So for example, we do like vulnerability scanning, which means we run automated tools such as Nessus or OpenVAS to find out the weaknesses in the system. These are also important to, to see like keep monitoring continuously if there are any, things that are being updated or there are new threats that can be introduced to the system. But there is another approach which is called secure by design, which means we do threat analysis or threat, I would say threat modeling before we develop the system. So one way is that you bring experts, they sit together and they brainstorm and they identify the threats. The second way is that you have those standards which are publicly available or they are, designed or developed by, experts such as OWASP. So we also can use those standards, NIST 800 or some other standards in order to identify the latest kind of vulnerabilities or threats that may, hinder the, execution of your system or avoid you from the cybersecurity threats. Sometimes we have those threats modeling frameworks such as Stride, Pasta, attack trees. Sometimes also we do system decomposition in order to find out different threats at different layers of the systems. For example, we have device layer, we have network layer, we have application layer. So there are so many ways by which one can identify the possible threats to a system, but that's always a good practice that you go secure by design approach, which means you, when you are making a new system, try to use this way that you brainstorm or you do use any available standards or frameworks to identify threats which can be vulnerable to your system. That's why like I thought to bring you this important topic today, which is where we have to. I will explain you that there is a standard which is public standard. Like I would say that experts have made it. So this is OWASP IoT top 10 security risks or threats. So let me quickly explain you about this. That this OWASP it stands for Open Web Application Security Project. So it is primarily designed for web application security, but now it is because we know that IoT is not a simple system. It has a lot of components to it. So this standards represents the most critical security concerns in the Internet of Things ecosystem. Excuse me. This list serves as an essential reference for manufacturers, developers, and security professionals. Working with connected devices. Unlike traditional IT security, IoT security encompasses a unique blend of hardware, firmware, network, and cloud component that create distinct security challenges. In 2018, the list that I'm presenting has represent a significant evolution from the previous iteration. Means they have one list presented in 2014. It was the first IoT top 10 published, focusing primarily on consumer device security. But this updated list reflecting increased IoT adoption across industry and more sophisticated attack vectors. So currently we have that list available. So that's why I'm discussing that one. So, in the IoT security landscape presents unique challenges for several reasons. For instance, many IoT manufacturers come from hardware background with limited security expertise. Devices often, have constraints, computing resources that limit security implementations, right? The diverse ecosystem includes many, proprietary protocols and system. Physical access to devices create additional attack vectors not present in the traditional IT. So understanding these risks enable organizations to implement appropriate security controls through the IoT devices, like the device lifecycle from design and manufacturing to deployment and eventually decompositioning. So that's why like we have these top 10 risks or threats that I would say discuss in this video with examples and mitigation strategies. So the first and foremost and very important kind of attack or sorry threat is weak or guessable or hard-coded password. So weak authentication mechanism represent the most pervasive and dangerous vulnerability in IoT systems. This risk encompasses several related issues, including default credentials, hard-coded password, inadequate password policies. The vulnerability exists across the multiple attack surfaces, including administrative interface, device web interface, cloud interface, and mobile application as well. So attack factors can be like user nomination, default credentials, or brute force attack. So that these can be exploited. So we have heard of this Mirai botnet, which caused the widespread internet outage in 2016, primarily leveraged IoT devices with default or weak passwords. Just imagine that the attack utilized a relative small dictionary of just 61 username or password combination, yet was able to compromise hundreds of thousands of devices. So Nick, you just imagine like more recently, similar botnet like Reappear or Cairo have continued to exploit weak authentication mechanism in IoT devices, right? So the Mirai botnet demonstrated that even simple authentication vulnerabilities can lead to devastating consequences when exploited at scale across the IoT devices. How can we detect manual testing of authentication, automated scanning using tools like Hydra or specialized IoT security scanners, firmware analysis to identify hard-coded credentials and configuration files or binaries. You can also use network traffic analysis to identify clear text password, transformation, reviewing device documentation for default password information. So, I mean, like these are detection methodologies where mitigation strategies can be like you should enforce strong password policies, complexity, length, prevention, common passwords, implement account lockout mechanism after 3 to 5 failed attempts, require password change on first use, generate unique default credentials for each device, implement two-factor authentication, which is very, very important these days, wherever it's practical in IoT, conduct regular security audits to avoid to identify authentication weaknesses, develop secure passwords and recoveries, right? So the second threat is called insecure network service. Insecure network service represent a significant attack factor for IoT devices, particularly those directly exposed to the internet or local networks. This vulnerability encompasses, unnecessary open ports, insecurely configured services, and service vulnerabilities to buffer overflow attacks or denial of service conditions. The primary concern with this insecure network service is that they expand the device's attack surface, providing potential entry points for attackers to gain unauthorized access, like which extracts the sensitive information or disrupt the device functionality. Given that many IoT devices are deployed in sensitive environments such as homes, healthcare facilities, or industrial settings, these vulnerabilities can have serious real-world consequences. So, vulnerabilities like common vulnerabilities like unencrypted remote access, outdated version or weak configuration, frequently misconfigured to allow external access. These can be so many examples I can point out here. But like attack scenario can be network scanning, service exploitation, and unauthorized access. Like let's say the network is scanning, like attackers scan for vulnerable device using tools like Shodan, or Senses to identify specific device types with known vulnerabilities. So the detection methodologies can be port scanning with tools like Nmap to identify open ports in running services. Vulnerability scanning with specialized IoT security tools, protocols analysis to identify unencrypted communication. Same like fuzzying techniques to identify buffer overflow. Review of device documentation and specification for unnecessary services. How one can mitigate these things. So mitigation strategies follow the principle of least privilege by disabling unnecessary services by default. That's one of the things. Like if you give the least privilege, implement proper encryption for all network communication like TLS instead of plain text, right? Configure service to run with minimal privilege, regular update, implement rate limiting to prevent denial of service attack, user proper input validation, consider network segmentation, and like, for example, implement proper authentication for all network services. And the third one, which is called insecure ecosystem interface. So IoT ecosystem typically include multiple interface beyond the device itself, including web interfaces, cloud service, interfaces, mobile application interfaces, and a lot of other APIs. These ecosystem interface often represent significant security vulnerabilities that can compromise the entire IoT deployment. Insecure interface may allow attackers to bypass authentication, execute code remotely, or extract sensitive data. So the key interface type vulnerabilities can be web interface, mobile interface, and cloud interface. Like let's say talking about web interfaces, so XSS like cross-site scripting is one of the things that can occur from web interface. SQL injection can occur from the web interface. From the mobile application, like insecure data storage, lack of binary protection, hard-coded credential. From cloud APIs, inadequate authentication, missing authorization checks, and excessive data exposure. So one of the real example, like I would say, interface vulnerabilities have led to numerous high-profile, security incidents. Let's say in 2019, researchers discovered a vulnerability in a major smart home platform cloud API that cloud had allowed attackers to take over user accounts and control connected devices, including door locks, security system, for instance. So similarly, vulnerabilities in healthcare IoT platform expose patients' data and potentially compromise the medical device functionalities. So detection methodologies could be web applications, security testing. We have this OWASP app or burp suit, which we can use. Mobile application security assessment with the static and dynamic analysis. API security testing, like manual penetration testing. Session management, authentication flow analysis, and so on and so forth, right? So common API vulnerabilities we discussed like broken authentication, excessive, data exposure, lack of resources, and rate limiting. So these can basically be the top-notch API vulnerabilities. So how one can mitigate? Definitely follow secure API design principles such as you have the OWASP API security top 10, right? This is one of the examples. Use API keys like authentication token and other modern authentication mechanism. Implement the rate limiting and resource monitoring and so on and so forth, right? So let's go further. Let's talk about lack of secure update mechanism. This is the impact of this vulnerability is particularly severe because it prevents remediation of other security issues discovered after device deployment. So without a secure way to update device in the field, vulnerabilities may remain exploitable for entire device lifecycle, which can span many years in additional, many years industrial infrastructure contacts, right? So that's why lack of secure update mechanism is really, really important for us to be taking care, in a way that it does not create more problems. So so the processes are like, missing verification, vulnerabilities in, vulnerable installation, no role backup protection, insecure delivery. Then this all is like a complete process, has to be updated. So what can be the detection methodologies for that? We're going to say like a firmware analysis to identify update functionality and security controls, network traffic analysis during update process, attempt to modify firmware package to test verification. The review and update is also important. Testing of main and the middle vulnerabilities during these updates, very, very important also. So let's talk about the fifth one called use of insecure outdated component. We know that it's also possible because we have so many connected devices. So those devices basically sometimes are not being updated. So what we say here is that this vulnerability is particularly common in IoT due to long development cycle, cost constraint, and the challenges of updating embedded components. So, IoT devices often incorporate numerous third-party components, including operating system, communication libraries, cryptographic implementation, and various other software, right? So, a type of vulnerable components are firmware, hardware, and software, which means, we have bootloader drivers and embedded code. We have chips like we have radio sensors and interfaces that all in hardware. We have in software, we have operating system libraries, framework applications. So many components can be, there, which can create this possibilities of the threat. So let's take an example like in 2014. Heartbleed vulnerability in OpenSSL demonstrated the widespread impact of vulnerable component. Despite the patches being quickly available, many IoT devices continued using vulnerable OpenSSL versions for years afterwards. Similarly, the 2020 discovery of Ripple 20 vulnerabilities in the widely used TCP/IP state, affected devices across multiple industry, many of which could not be updated. So, detection methodologies here we would say is that the binary analysis to identify component versions and known vulnerabilities. That's what I'm talking about here. So software component analysis, SCA tools adopt for firmware, version fingerprinting of exposed services, comparing component against vulnerability databases like CVE and VD, it can be also used, monitoring security advisory for components used in devices, right? So mitigation strategies can be like implementing a software bill of material, so SBOM for all devices, right? A regular update component to address the known vulnerabilities, monitoring security advisory for third-party, components, and so on and so forth. So, okay, so let's talk about the sixth important or very, very crucial trait that's called insufficient privacy protection, right? So this vulnerability is particularly significant as IoT devices increasingly enter private spaces like homes, vehicles, and healthcare environments. Poor privacy protection not only creates security risk, but can also lead to regulatory violations under frameworks like GDPR, CCPA, and sector-specific regulations. So we have to be very much concerned about that. So, we know that IoT is using excessive data collection beyond what's needed for functionality sometimes. Inadequate disclosure of the data collection, practices can be one of the privacy concerns. Insecure transformation of personal data would also be one of the problems, right? So data privacy risk areas are when we are collecting, when we are processing, when we are storing, or sharing, or disposing. All these possible ways, possible areas can be at risk. So let's say privacy violation in IoT have led to significant incidents. Like in 2019, a major smart home device manufacturer admitted that employees could access users' audio recordings. So other cases involve fitness tracking trackers revealing sensitive location data of military personnel, and smart TVs collecting and sharing viewing habits without adequate disclosure to the users. So these are the big concerns that we have to, think of. So privacy by design principle for IoT is like proactive, not reactive, as I just told you. Privacy as default, privacy embedded, full functionality, like avoid false trade-off between privacy and core functionalities. End-to-end security is also very important. Like protect data throughout its entire life cycle, as I mentioned just now. So user-centric, provide user controls and respect individuals' privacy. So how can we mitigate these challenges and implement data minimization, like collect only what's necessary? That's very, very important, and especially in such type of threats. Provide clear, understandable, like privacy notices to the users. Obtain explicit consents for data collection. That's very important. Encrypt all the sensitive data, both in transit or at rest. That's very, very important. And establish data breach notification procedures also. So privacy protection in IoT requires a comprehensive approach that consider not just technical controls, but also organizational policies, user communication, and legal compliance aspect as well. So let's move on to the seventh trait that's called insecure data transfer and storage. Once again, this vulnerability encompasses weaknesses in how data is protected, both when it's transmitted between system components and when stored on device. So issues like ranges from missing encryption to improper certificate validation is the reason, right? Also, inadequate key management can be one of the reasons, right? So let's say how these data security vulnerabilities happen, like data in transit. So when it's transit, so which means weak encryption algorithm, improper certification, as I just mentioned. When data at rest, which is poor database security, improper handling of sensitive data. Also, things we have to understand. So if I see like these days, like different reports are being produced where on the top is unencrypted data is one of the top-notch issues that's happening, or weak encryption is also one of the important issues happening in here. So how can one detect by network traffic analysis, API security testing, or cryptographic implementation review, key management assessment, certificate validation testing? These are the detection methods. How one can mitigate them? So follow up secure coding practices, definitely implement strong encryption for all sensitive data in transit like TLS 1.2 plus or equivalent, right? So encrypt sensitive data at rest using appropriate algorithms, and consider data minimization to reduce the security burdens, as I mentioned. So let's talk about the eighth one, which is called lack of device management. So this vulnerability encompasses several related issues, including absence of assets management, difficulties in configuration management, challenges in monitoring devices status, and inability to detect and respond to security incidents across a device fleet. So the lack of device management capabilities make it difficult or impossible to implement security control at scale, like track assets inventory, monitor device health, and respond to security incident effectively, right? So the big challenges here is that it is like tracking inventory of deployed devices, deploying updates across the device fleet, enforce security policies, decomposition in devices securely. That's one of these are the few very very important challenges that are being faced by device management level. So like the overall this cycle happens: authentication, configuration, monitoring, maintenance, decomposing, and provisioning, right? So this overall life cycle of device lifecycle management. So, the key device management capabilities such as asset inventory, configuration management, update management, monitoring, logging and auditing, and policy enforcement. These could be those few which I can mention about capabilities of the, key device management. How can we detect? Evaluating definitely the completeness of the device, testing the remote configuration, assessing monitoring and alerting effectiveness, reviewing, evaluating logging and audit capabilities. These can be those few of those detection methodologies. Okay, so let's jump on the second last one is called insecure default setting. Yeah, so as I can say, many IoT devices ship with insecure default configuration that prioritize ease of setup and functionality over security. So that's one of the fundamental things that we all do, right? So these default settings often include weak credentials, unnecessary open ports, enabled debugging interfaces, and access privileges. When users and administrators fail to change these settings, or when devices do not provide mechanism to change them, they create significant security vulnerabilities, right? So, how we can, think security by default principle is like, remote access, network services, authentication. We should, let's say, for authentication, we should unique per device credential, as I just mentioned earlier. Remote access, we disable by default, requires explicit activation. Encryption enabled by default with strong parameters, right? Logging, like comprehensive and enabled, logging should be like that, right? So, permissions like a least privilege principle. So these should be those ways by which one can actually mitigate those threats. So how about the last one? Let's just talk about lack of physical hindrance. Yeah, like traditional IT systems that often reside in secure data centers, like IoT devices are frequently deployed in publicly, accessible location, like home or field environment with minimal physical protection. This physical exposure creates unique security challenges that require specific, hardening measures, right? So side channel attack, firmware extraction, like bus monitoring, the component removal, reset attack or tempering. These are the attack factors on this layer. So we can basically make them happen, or we can mitigate these things by design phase, like incorporate all physical security requirements, development, like implement secure boot processes, disable or protect debug interface, like encrypt sensitive storage, and we also can work on manufacturing level or deployment level, like install device in secure location, use physical locks or enclosure where appropriate. So operation like monitor for physical tampering, implement tamper detection and response. These can be the ways by which we can mitigate. I think that's all about this OWASP top 10 IoT security risk and threats. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate to ask me. That's all.